chairing this session, and I know everybody has 15 minutes, and so I'm just going to say 5 minutes when it comes to about that to give you a warning. And without further ado, I'd just like to introduce Dr. Dermot O'Reilly, who's going to talk about mortality studies this morning.
Thank you, Nikki. Okay, my job is to talk about death and also about NILS' big sister, NIMS. And in fact, actually, NILS' older sister, NIMS, the Northern Ireland Mortality Study. So, in general, there's lots of different studies you can do using census data, and you've seen some examples of them here today. So, for example, in A, such as David's and John's, you compare what happens in a later census with the baseline measured at an earlier census, so changes in marital status, socioeconomic status, and so on. In B, sometimes when people are interested in events that happen in between the census points, such as maybe people have one child and then they have another child, or somebody gets cancer and then dies, so you get survival rates and so on. But for these sorts of studies I'm going to talk about, it's C, which is you start with the census and you follow up and you measure the outcome. In this case, it's death and only death, because NIMS only looks at death. But that's okay, because death as an outcome is actually really good. Because from a statistical scientific perspective at least, it's obviously a statutory obligation to record the death, so it's complete. The data are of known high quality, and researchers have got a long experience of using mortality data, and that's kind of good. And actually, when you look back at the history of longitudinal studies, the parent of all of these was the Office for National Statistics Longitudinal Study, and one of the first reasons for setting that up was to understand the social gradients in mortality and linking it from social class at the census and following up the mortality risk over subsequent years. Which brings me to the Northern Ireland Mortality Study. So again, if you're interested in births or change of social status, this is not the study you use, but if you're interested in death, then this is your study of choice. And as I said, it just precedes the NILS by about 6 to 9 months. And one of the benefits of it is, the benefit is that instead of starting with 28% of the population, it uses 100% of the enumerated population. And that's very important because that allows you to say very powerful things about smaller areas or smaller subsets of the population. And there's been at least 2 NIMS, started from 2001 forward, to at least 10 years, and now starting in 2011 census and following up until at least 2015 deaths. So I'm going to have a quick nimble dance through, or disco through all of these different types of study that we have done here, and try not to do too much disservice to the researchers who've done this research. So what sort of things have we found? Well, obviously inequalities, as you've seen with NILS, it permeates a lot of the work on the mortality studies that we've done to date. And indeed, colleagues in the department have come down and looked not just at inequalities in general, but all used NIMS to look at the Section 75 categories of inequalities as well. One of the things we've done about halfway through the study was we realised that house value, as people have mentioned before, is a very useful indicator. And here we were making the case that it's an indicator of accumulated wealth over a lifetime, and it's a very strong indicator of general health, but also mortality risk, and especially for older people for whom the standard indicators of disadvantage don't work very well. And it's a very accessible measure. On the other hand, people will see, if you look at areas, and you will see differences in mortality risk between areas, and a question whether the selective migration of, say, the more healthy and perhaps wealthier people contributes to those geographical differences. As you see, NIMS has shown both here in Northern Ireland, as have similar studies in the rest of the UK, showing that selective migration doesn't really contribute much to those increasing differences between areas. On the other hand, people coming to Northern Ireland can be studied as well with NIMS, and that's we've shown that if you come from, say, like Scotland with its higher mortality rate, that is reflected in the people from Scotland who live in Northern Ireland. They have about 18% higher mortality rate overall, but nearly 45 to 50% higher risk of ischemic heart disease. Perhaps just like the Scots back in Scotland as well. And of course, being Northern Ireland, denomination or religion has been a study of quite a few mortality studies. But as David suggested, because of this larger sample size in NIMS, we're able to push beyond the standard dichotomy of just Catholics and Protestants, but look at the other denominations as well. And the big finding here was that the much lower mortality rate of the more conservative Protestant denominations that David mentioned before. And they have about a 20% lower risk of mortality, but maybe half the risk of dying from alcohol-related causes and tobacco-related causes as well. Obviously indicative of lifestyle. There are a whole bunch of studies related about where you live, and is that also important for your health and mortality risk. And one of the first studies we did in NIMS was to look at the differences between people who lived in urban areas and people who lived in rural areas. And again, there's about 20% higher risk of dying if you live in the city, some of them in Belfast area type city. And that increases to nearly 40% higher if you're looking for respiratory deaths and deaths from lung cancer. And now, with the recent news in the press about banning of diesel cars and so on, you might suggest that pollution is a major contributor to those. Where you live is also picked up in alcohol-related causes of death. Of course, there's large social gradients, but those are mostly related to individual household levels of indicator, not where you live. But even if you adjust for that, there is still about a 30% higher risk of dying from an alcohol-related cause if you live in an urban setting compared to somebody who lives in a rural setting. We don't actually know what the reason for that is. On the other hand, you will see large differences between areas for suicide risk, a rare event, and it takes the whole population approach in NIMS to be able to study these outcomes. But the differences between areas for suicide are entirely explained by the types of people who live in those areas, and it seems to be that area characteristics don't add significantly to that risk. But NIMS, aligned with other studies, other longitudinal studies across the UK, allows it to show the variation that happens across different countries. And we see, for example, that compared to Northern Ireland, the Scots, of course, have higher mortality risk, but actually much lower risks of self-reported poor health. And we don't know the reason for those differences either. And as I said before, NIMS allows you to look at some populations in much greater detail and much more assurance. So, for example, we were able to mark, one of the first things we did was to look at the variations in mortality within care homes. And while we wouldn't suggest that's a useful measure of quality of care, it can be used for planning for services in the future. Quite a bit of papers looking at both people who are carers and more recently people who are volunteers. And we were able to confirm, as others have done, that if you are a volunteer, then you have got about a 30% lower risk of mortality in subsequent years. Perhaps more surprisingly, given the bad news and bad press about being a carer, you have exactly the same order of magnitude of a reduced mortality risk if you're a carer. And that's even people who are providing significant levels of caring of more than 50 hours a week. And it doesn't seem to be matter really who you're caring for, and it doesn't seem to matter whether you've got poor health yourself or not. There's also some suggestion that if you're both a carer and a volunteer, that there's synergy and that they have got a lower mortality risk again. We were really pushing the data a bit when we looked at variation by occupations, and of course we're always interested in the health of doctors, and they do seem to have a lower mortality risk, doctors and dentists, than other people in professional and senior managerial type occupations. But vets seem to have a slightly higher mortality risk, though it straddles one and we can't be entirely sure about that. But it does seem to tie in with their 3 to 4 fold increased risk of poor mental health. So I think it's not doctors, it's vets we should be concentrating in Northern Ireland. And finally, workers. One of the things we did about 2 years ago was to look at long working hours, and this is particularly pertinent coming up to Christmas time. So if you're part of that 10% of the population who work more than 55 hours a week, we suggest you don't do that and stop immediately. I'll write to your employer if you want on your behalf. You have a 20% increased risk of dying if you're working more than 55 hours a week, and that rises to 45% increased risk of cardiovascular death if you're working more than 55 hours a week. So I think I'll stop there. Oh, and I'll also add my thanks to Orla Bateson, and who's in the audience, and to all the support staff who are a pleasure to work with and make it all so much easier to work for. Thank you.